Hello, everyone. We're live, and I'm here with Odon Lafontaine once again. And today we're going to speak about the invention of Islam. And I believe Odon's going to focus on the Abbasid Caliphate and how they had to, do some really interesting, well, some interesting logic and some interesting narrative recreation to try to reconcile their story with the Umayyads. And but yeah, thanks, Odon. The floor is yours, and introduce yourself to the audience, who some of those who may not know you, and then what we're talking about today, because it sounds very interesting.
Yes, thank you, Lloyd. Hello, everyone, and thanks, Lloyd, for having me once again. I'm Odon Lafontaine. I'm the writer and the author of this book, The Great Secret of Islam, which is a sort of synthesis of what actually happened at the beginning of Islam. The thing is, we don't really know Islam's history. We only have in the general discourse, we only have the Islamic narrative that tells us that there was a guy, that was a so-called prophet, Muhammad, who preached the Quran to pagan Arabs in the Hijaz region in the 7th century. And Islam emerged from this. And this narrative has sort of printed itself very, very deeply in the consciousness of Muslims, of course, but also of non-Muslims, historians, scholars. And the thing is, with this concept in mind, you cannot understand what actually happened in the beginning of Islam. And what I try to do is build upon the groundbreaking work of Belgian scholar Edouard Marie Galès, who wrote a thesis in 2004 called Le Messie et son prophète, the Messiah and his prophets, and who already made a sort of synthesis of all the scholarship, the Islamology scholarship that was available at his time. And what I did, I worked with him and with other scholars, like Robert Kerr, for example, who is the director of the Inara Institute in Germany. And I wrote a book that is a sort of update of his thesis in the light of all the new research that has been published in 2004. And we are witnessing a very exciting time, because there is a sort of an avalanche, a cascade of new discoveries within every field. For example, archaeology, we have found new coins, we have found archaeological remains of very ancient mosques, codicology, the study of ancient manuscripts, history, and so on. And this completely changes the perspective over Islam. And what I did is a sort I must say that I am not a scholar myself. I am not a professor. I have not an academic background in Islamology, even though I studied Islam and Islamology since more than 15 years now. Actually, I have a business background. I used to work as a strategy consultant, and this is the work I did in my book. I thought, and I'm still thinking, as a consultant, a strategy consultant, trying to get the big picture, trying to point at the very important stuff, whereas most scholars use a sort of brute force. They try to uncover everything, to know everything about a topic, and they cannot make up their mind about Islam and early Islam, because they don't know everything. Whereas me, I don't have the same approach, even though I abide by the same scientific principle. Yeah, I'm looking at the comments. This one is very interesting. And I will address exactly this issue in my introduction. what I was telling is working as a strategy consultant allowed me to get the big picture that most scholars don't get. They are very specialized, and they don't have this this mind for synthesis and seeing the grand scheme of things. So this is what I'm about to present here. I have prepared a very neat PowerPoint that maybe I should see where. How can I share my screen?
Yeah. Just to comment on something you said, I mean, my background when I got into Islam in a serious way was I was working in the Middle East, and I was working in a security / national security career path. And when I started to analyze, I mean, one of the things we have to do is, as you're working as a consultant / salesperson / engineer, but you don't have all the information. You work with probabilities, you work with likelihoods, you study, you look at the mindset, you look at the thinking, the intentions, the ideology, the strategic habits of your opponent. You look at their tactics, and you look at what are their capabilities, and you work out how are they going to probabilistically do something. And one of the questions you ask yourself is, how are they going to deceive me? How can I deceive them? How can I preempt them? And I brought that very same thinking when I started to look at Islam, and I started to think, okay, they're trying to fool us. They're trying to deceive us. They have strategic goals. They have tactical tools that they're utilizing, and they're trying to misdirect us. They're trying to redirect us. They're trying to fool us. They're trying to gaslight us. How do we cut through the confusion? And I was like, okay, so then I got into the Sharia, and I started to work out these are the foundations. They must be objective foundations. And so if it worked for me, it can work for you, I think. Because something you mentioned earlier was the scholars that you read this book. You said this very interesting book about a scholar that had to. Hopefully, you'll just mention that briefly. If you'll just repeat that for the audience in a minute. My takeaway is, though, that many scholars have all of the facts, but what I find frustrating is that somehow they come to predictably all the wrong conclusions, or they fall very far short of drawing the conclusion. So all the facts are there. They all point in one direction, and somehow they end up in the wrong place, or they somehow just fail to connect the dots. And I can understand why. They don't want to lose their $2 million a year scholarship funding, or get injured badly in the parking lot one day by a crazy maniac with the, But on that thought, can you just mention the scholar you mentioned, the book you read, and just the point you made earlier today, just a few minutes ago with me?
His name is Edouard Marie Gallet, or Galez. Gallez.
All right. Yeah. And you mentioned the Umayyad and Abbasid, the contradiction there, and how they had to reconcile that.
I'm sorry, Lloyd. I didn't get your.
Oh no, you mentioned that the book that the Abbasids had invented or fabricated the Islamic history, but yet they had to incorporate the Umayyad history, while at the same time they had to undermine the Umayyads to give themselves legitimacy. But at the same time, they had to somehow give credibility to the Umayyad narrative to again give credibility to the transmission of the Quran, which is a complete set of contradictions. Can you just mention that, and how the scholar actually supports the Islamic narrative?
The other one,
evidence points in exactly the opposite direction.
His name is Antoine Borrut. B-O-R-R-U-T. He is a professor at the Maryland University, and he is a specialist of the Abbasid history. Let's call it this way. I'm just looking for the exact reference of the book I was telling you about before we went live. Let me just find it. It's here. Antoine Borrut. So actually, it's in French. He directed a book to pay homage, a sort of tribute to a fantastic French Islamologist, really a pioneer, who died in 2005. His name was Alfred Louis de Prémar. And he directed a book that was a sort of tribute with many different scholars writing essays and articles. The book is called La Fabrique de l'Histoire et de la Tradition Islamique. How would I translate it? It is the
fabrication of the history of the narrative of Islam.
Exactly. And in his introduction, very interesting text. He writes about. Excuse me. This is one of his. The book I just quoted, La Fabrique de l'Histoire, the Fabrication of History. It's a book only from him, but I was referring to another book, the book that is a tribute to Alfred Louis de Prémar, which is called Écriture de l'histoire et processus de canonisation dans les premiers siècles de l'histoire. So, writing history and canonizing it during the first centuries of Islam. And his introduction is about La Fabrique de l'Histoire et de la Tradition Islamique. This is the title of his introduction. And this is very interesting because he explains how the Abbasid reshaped the Islamic history according to their own views. Especially, they reshaped the Umayyad history. We only know, most of what we know of the Umayyad dynasty comes from the Abbasid books, the Abbasid literature, the Abbasid narrative. And it was a very tricky point for them. I will go back to this in detail in my presentation, because the Abbasid overthrew the Umayyads in the 8th century. And so they became the caliphs instead, and they installed their own dynasty. So the Umayyads were their enemies. So they had to depict them as enemies in their literature. They had to depict them as being not so good Muslims. But they also had to acknowledge that they relied on them for the transmission of Islam and of the Quran. And so it was a very tricky work for the traditionists who wrote the stories of the Umayyad and the Abbasid transition and so on. How could they depict the Umayyad as being both not that good Muslim, but good Muslim enough to have preserved the Quran and the faith up to the Abbasids? And this is what Antoine Boru explained in this introduction, The Making of Islamic History and Tradition. And it has been translated into English. You found it, so your audience.
Yeah, I'll just paste this in the chat for everyone. I want to mention that within the Encyclopedia of Islam, they speak of the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and the Abbasids at that time still called themselves the Believers, whereas it was a subsect within the Umayyads who started to use the term Muslims to differentiate themselves, because the Believers was a sort of was a what do you call it, ecumenical movement, monotheistic movement of people who believed in, like, of a monotheistic God. So it was made up of apparently sort of Jews or pseudo-biblical Jews and heretical Christians and Muslims, and they were the Believers. But then the Muslims wanted to create the Arabs wanted to create their own unique identity, because this alliance is falling apart. And the Umayyads, one sect within the Umayyads, had adopted the name Muslims, and that apparently became the name that the Abbasids took to identify themselves as a unique grouping, and they split off on their own.
You're referring to the theory, the hypothesis of Fred Donner.
This is also within the Encyclopedia of Islam.
A book called Muhammad and the Believers. But there is a thing, you see, when you are referring actually to the Arabic word muminun or muminin.
Mu'minin, yeah. Although that is derived
And
from a
this
Greek
word,
word which means heretic.
this word is much more. Its meaning is much more richer than the believer.
Yeah, technically,
And
from an
Muminun is someone who has given his face to something or his allegiance to someone. That someone could be God, but it can also be the Messiah. It can also be the Caliph. So when for example, when Muawiyah, supposedly the fourth Caliph of Islam, the fifth Caliph of Islam, or the fifth leader, and the first Umayyad, he writes on his coin that he is Amir al-Muminun,
yeah,
commander of the believers. It can also mean that he is the commander of those who have given his allegiance to him.
yeah. The word, however, derives from a Hebrew term, from a Hebrew word, which actually means heretics.
Oh, okay, but let's focus on the
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the topic, though.
topic of this evening, because it's
Sure.
it's complex enough. But
Yeah.
feel
No,
free,
but this
Lloyd,
is really
to.
interesting. I mean, the this walking on eggs that the Abbasids had to do. It's a really interesting topic on its own. So yeah. So over to you again on the topic. Do you want to share your screen? Please go ahead.
Yeah. Let's share the screen. How do I do this?
It says present, bottom middle. It says present.
Just share my screen, okay. All right, let's share the screen with. Okay. I don't find my presentation. It's strange because the PowerPoint file is open, but I cannot find it in the StreamYard software.
If you say present, share screen, you should just just choose entire screen on the top right.
If I
Go
do
to
this,
window.
my whole screen is shared,
So now
and
bring up your
then I will
PowerPoint.
put on the presentation.
Yeah, start your presentation. There it is.
Okay. And if I do
You can
this,
just press F5. There it is.
okay. But Lloyd, I cannot see you then. So I'm talking to my
I'm so
screen,
sorry.
and also I cannot see the comments of the audience. So Lloyd, please feel free to interrupt me. And since I cannot see you, you have to be very verbal.
Understood. Sorry about that. Okay.
And so this presentation is
Although
about
if you go back to the, but then you can't change the slides. Oh gosh. If you're in the studio, you can't change the slides. Yeah. Okay.
I can do this. I can switch the slides. You see the slide changing. Working. So it's working. All right. So it's about the Islamic narrative. There is this this nickname, the standard Islamic narrative, and how it was fabricated. Actually, what I wanted to begin with, we already talked about it. It's about asking the right questions about early Islam and what Islam is. Most people tend to want to know Islam by asking simple questions such as who was the real Muhammad, or was Muhammad the prophet, or what was the original Quran? Did Muhammad preach the Quran? Was Muhammad born in Mecca, for example, or did the Caliph change the Quran? And they expect that this question will answer the big question, that is, what is Islam? But actually, all those questions do not one of these questions makes sense, because if you don't know what actually happened, if you don't know the big picture, you cannot understand what is Islam, and the question of Muhammad becomes senseless, because you don't know how did Islam emerge and create its narrative? And this is the right question to ask. If you want to know Islam, the best way to know Islam is not to look for the real Muhammad or the real Mecca, but to look at how did Islam emerge and how did it create its own narrative. And I would like to quote here Patricia Crone, who was a very top-notch Islamic scholar. She was not a Muslim herself. She taught in London and then in the US, and she wrote. She was one of the members of the so-called revisionist school, and she really shook the ground at the end of the 70s when she published a book with Michael Cook about early Islam called Hagarism. But she kept on working on early Islam, and she understood what she wrote in this quotation. We have to start by understanding the Quran on the basis of information supplied by the book itself, as opposed to that of later readers, and to understand this information in the light of developments known to have preceded its formation rather than those engendered by the book itself. This is very, very important. She is actually saying that we cannot understand the Quran, and therefore we cannot understand Islam's history if we refer to much later sources. And she puts here a very basic principle for historical methodology. But this principle, even though it is very basic and very scientific, is a bit overlooked by most scholars. And this is a pity because they cannot understand, they cannot hope to understand anything about Islam if they only refer to, for example, the Abbasid literature, which was fabricated and written centuries after the facts in a completely different context and a completely different set of mind. And in order to, yeah, Lloyd, go on.
Yes, sorry.
No, I'm sorry, Lloyd. I thought you wanted to ask something.
No. I'm just listening.
Okay. And so, in order to understand Islam history, we have to do a sort of a study based on sources from the 7th centuries, and it's only after having studied those sources that we can look at later sources and Islamic sources and engage them in a very critical study. And thanks to this, I managed to get a sort of synthesis of what actually happened in the 7th century. And I will present it now. It's a sort of synthesis. I will be a bit fast because this is not the point of this presentation. But everything is open to debate, and you can ask every question about what I am about to tell. I want to start by the religious context. At the beginning of the 7th century, the people in the Middle East were mostly Christian and some Jews. Most of the population was Christian. Something like 90% of the population of the Middle East was Christian. And they thought it was the end of times. They were witnessing a great war between the two great empires of the region, between Persia and Byzantium. And there were devastation, slaughters, terrible pandemics. And because of this, there were some apocalypse prophets who thrived among the Arabs. and we witnessed movements of Arab prophetism among the Arabs they are described in the Islamic tradition, in the Islamic narrative.
Mm-hmm.
We have, of course, Muhammad, should he have existed, but we have also other prophets that are called anti-prophets in the Islamic narrative. So it tells us that during this time, there was this end of time set of mind, and several movements, several apocalyptic Arab movements coexisted. And within this movement, there was at least one guy that was nicknamed Muhammad or Mahmad.
Can
We
I
have
mention
evidence for
something
this.
on that first point? I did a study once. I need to get back to it and fill it out even more. But perhaps the very earliest heresy that we have solid recording of is there was a book written somewhere between maybe the year 95 and the year 120, and it's called the Book of Al-Chasai. It's not very well known, but it was a book that was given to a prophet. It was sent down to him by an angel. Don't know if that sounds familiar at all. Right? And the angel, sorry.
Yeah, it's a very common trait in the 3rd century. Prophet Mani, the founder of Manichaeism,
now Mani
also claimed the same.
Now Mani belonged to the sect that I just mentioned. This was a Gnostic group.
Okay.
So Mani's father. So the Al-Chasai, Mani's father belonged to the Al-Chasai. Mani grew up in the Al-Chasai until he was about 20 years old, and then he left and formed his own Gnostic interpretation of this. He added his own personal spin to the Al-Chasai teachings and created his Manichaeism. However, this idea, the Al-Chasai was a spin on Jewish end times prophecy. They were preaching a cataclysm as well, and for instance, they speak in the Islamic context. Aisha mentions, it's one of the hadiths. Aisha mentions that Muhammad, as a couple of times, he saw the angel Jibril, in his real form. And in his real form, he's a giant. His head touches the sky. His shoulders are as wide as the horizon, and his feet are massive. And in the story of the Al-Chasai, the angel that gives the book is 90 kilometers tall. His feet are 4 kilometers wide, 12 kilometers long, and his shoulders are 28 kilometers wide and stuff like that. A massive angel. So there are many, many parallels with the teachings in the book of Al-Chasai and the character of Al-Chasai, the prophet, and Muhammad. And so you go from Al-Chasai to Mani in the 4th century, and then so hundreds of years later, the idea is still there. This cult still exists. And then you get to Islam, and many, many of these ideas, these Jewish ideas, which were taken from, I wouldn't say necessarily Orthodox Jewish ideas, but many of these ideas that come from Jewish myth and so on, this continues. So some of this get into, and this idea of apocalypse goes back to as early as perhaps the 1st century or very early 2nd century.
But you see, within Judaism and also within Christianity, there is this kind of the same idea that the end of times will see the coming of a Messiah. Of course, in Christianity, it will be the second coming of Jesus. But also for Jews, they are still waiting for their Messiah, which will not be Jesus. And so in this Jewish and Christian context of the Middle East, when people think that the end of time is coming, they are waiting for the Messiah to come. And what we saw in the early 7th century is at least one guy who had a very, very strange nickname. The nickname was Mahmad or Muhammad, but Muhammad is the Arabic pronunciation and Islamic pronunciation of the word MHMD. This is the only trace that we have, MHMD, or in some sources it's MHMT, Mahmet or Mahmad. And we know, thanks to modern scholarship, that Mahmad was used in Jewish and also Christian Arabic context to refer to Jesus, or to the Messiah, to Jesus for the Christians, and to the Messiah himself for the Jews. It was a messianic title. And we know that one of the armed Arab prophetism movements was led by a person nicknamed Mahmad. We have several sources that attest it, but it doesn't mean that he was the Muhammad from Islam, because the sources describe a very different character. They describe him as being a precursor of the Messiah, someone who is announcing the imminent coming of Jesus. Someone also who urges the Arabs to seize the Holy Land, so Palestine, as their rightful heritage, their rightful heritage from Abraham. This is not exactly the Islamic Muhammad. It's much more Christian-like or Judeo-Christian-like. And what we saw thereafter is that in the turmoils of the war between Persia and Byzantium, when Byzantium completely vanquished Persia, there was a sort of void of power. And the Arabs, these various movements, seized the power that were left vacant by the collapse of Persia and by the exhaustion of Byzantium. And there were raids from Arab faction in Mesopotamia, in Palestine, in Syria, in Egypt, and they seized power. And especially, they went to Jerusalem around 638, and there they rebuilt the temple. It's a very, very important event that is now well documented. We have traces of it in Christian and Jewish sources, and we also have traces of it in the Islamic narrative. The faction that took Jerusalem was described as being led by people described as Jews. So I think they were not rabbinic Jews, because when we really look into the Quran is we will get to what the Quran is, but let's just assume that most of the text of the Quran dates from the 7th century. It is one of the earliest witness of the events of early Islam. And the Quran describes a very strange Jewish community that is not rabbinic, that is a very, very small group, and that is allied with the believers. And I think those people called the Nasara in the Quran, so Nazarenes, in the Islamic narrative, they are supposed to be Christians. But when we really look into the Quran, we see that they cannot be Christian. There are some major contradictions within the text, which tell us that the Nasara that are described in the Quran cannot be Christian. Anyhow, we have so reason to believe that the faction that took Jerusalem had made an alliance with these Jews, these Nazarene Jews, Judeo-Nazarenes, as I call them in my book. And it will be the explanation for the biblical knowledge we find in the Quran. There is a source called the Pseudo-Sibios, which was written around the 660s, which tells us that Mahmet, so the leader of some of the Arabs, was very knowledgeable in the story of Moses. We also see in the Quran some very we see a discourse and a knowledge of the Bible, of the Christian and Jewish concept, that tells us that there were teachers who knew about the Bible, who knew about the Jewish tradition, and those teachers form preachers. I think they form the historical Muhammad, they form Muhammad. They taught him how to address the Christian Arab audience and to urge them into having this alliance with them, with the Judeo-Nazarenes, so that they would seize Jerusalem, conquer Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple. The idea was to hasten the end of times. It's a common Jewish trait.
Right.
This idea is that human action, a political program, could hasten the end of times and hasten the coming of the Messiah. We have exactly the same idea nowadays with some hardcore Jewish Zionists who want to rebuild the temple and who in Jerusalem, and who make alliances with Christians. And we have sources that tell us that this already happened around 638, 640. So the temple was rebuilt, but the end of times did not come, and particularly the Messiah did not come back. And what we see thereafter is that the Arab leaders got rid of the Judeo-Nazarenes, and they fought among themselves over their claim to power, to total power, messianic power. We saw various factions fighting among themselves, various contestants. Basically, to put it in a simple way, there were two, but there were much more than two. But there were the Alids, so the proto-Shias, the basis for what would become centuries after Shiism, Shia Islam, and their leaders, especially Ali ibn Abu Talib, claimed to be the end times Messiah. And their opponents were the Umayyads, so the proto-Sunni Muslims, but there was no Islam at the time. We were in a sort of Christian apocalyptic context. And those people were not seen by other Christians as Muslims. They were seen as Christians or deviant Christians. And the Umayyads, they claimed to be God-chosen leaders because they were the strongest, because they won mostly over the Alids. And during this fight that is described as the fitna in the Islamic narrative, we see that the various leaders invented religious claims to justify their rule, their messianic rule. We see this,
in fact,
for example,
sorry?
Yeah, we see this, for example, in the coins they minted. They minted coins with in Bismillah, in the name of God. They minted coins. Yeah.
I just did a series recently on the reliability, the transmission of the Quran and the Hadiths. And Western scholars for centuries have come to the conclusion the fact that you have contradictory Quran verses and contradictory Hadiths is simple. The fact that these were fabricated to support a given religious, social, or political agenda. So the same. So this ties in very well. Again, they were making things up to suit whoever was in control or wanted to establish a narrative. They would create these, and in fact, there's lots of evidence that many of these narratives were created very late and then redacted back onto the followers of Muhammad or others close to the time, people of authority, so as to give their claims some kind of credibility.
We will get to this point exactly. But here we can say this. We can say this only by looking at actual evidence, solid evidence, coins, for example, or rock inscriptions that are very interesting because they are a sort of direct window to this past without intermediaries, without having been rewritten. When we look at the coins that Muawiyah, for example, minted, he put forth that he was the commander of the believers, so Amir al-Muminun, and Abdallah, God's servant, on the same coin. And when you put together those two expressions, that you are both God's servant and commander of the believers, it indicates that you are an intermediary between God and man. It's actually the role of the Messiah to be the commander of the believers and God's first servant. We also see some coins with the expression Mahmad, also the messianic title Mahmad. And we see in the Shia tradition, this is in the Shia tradition, that the leader, Ali or his sons or his successors, claim to be sort of God's envoy because they claim to have they claim to be the end time Messiah. They claim to be Jesus himself. We also see coins with the mention Mahmad Rasulullah, which is translated as Muhammad is God's envoy, according to the Islamic narrative interpretation, but which can also mean that we have to understand what Mahmad means. Mahmad means the desired one, the coveted one. And in some Arabic dialects, it can also mean the praised one. And when you look into Mahmad Rasulullah, it can mean praised be the one that God has sent, or desired be the one that God has sent. It is a messianic expression.
Right.
And when we look at coins with the image of a leader, a caliph, for example, even though the title wasn't given at the time, but the image of a leader and this motto, Mahmad Rasulullah, I think it refers to the leader himself. He says, I am the Mahmad, I am God's envoy. So worship me, praise me. And this fight among the various Arab factions goes on up until a candidate that is stronger than the other can impose his rule. But before I get to this point, I need to address the Quran issue.
Can I mention something? Just a couple of points I want to address, which you raised, which is very interesting. There's a comment here. The caliph in Islam is equal to the vicar of Christ on earth, political and spiritual authority with one man, which I don't believe is accurate, because then you would be referring to the Pope. And the caliph has political authority. The caliph is required to conduct warfare against non-Muslim states and non-Muslims twice per year, preferably, if not more often, but at least once per year, the caliph can be deposed. So the caliph is a war leader. He's a warlord. He raises an army. He directs the state to develop weaponry, and the economy is directed towards warfare and expansion. The Pope doesn't ride in front of armies and go and conquer their neighbors all the time and then conquer the next neighbors. He also is a political leader. He's also the social leader. He's the supreme leader. The Pope is not a supreme leader. I mean, I think that would be a very false comparison in terms of the authority.
This is why I don't want to talk about caliph yet.
Yeah.
Because at the time, there was no caliph title. At the time, we are around between the 640.
The Amir al-Mu'minin, which is the leader of the believers, or the commander of the believers. Yeah.
Is the commander of the believer, but the caliph title hasn't been invented yet. Abdul Malik, who will take power in 683 or 685, actually 665, He is the one who invented this title. But let me get to this.
Yeah, there's one more thing I just want to mention, if I can. I just bring this up. You've mentioned something about the control of the state and how within the caliphate, he's the representative of Allah's will on earth, and the state represents the will of Allah. Let me just share something because I've been asked recently about the overlap with Marxism. The whole the Marxist socialist ideology and its overlap with Islam, and then that's something I've been thinking about for about 2 years, and I am finally starting to actually discover. So before you get to Marx, you have to get to Hegel, and I just want to. Here's a couple of statements that are actually very much in line with what you have just said. This is Hegel, or these are translations of what Hegel said. The state is a supreme manifestation of the activity of God in the world.
Huh.
The Islamic State is a supreme manifestation of the activity of Allah in the world. The state stands above all. The caliph stands above all. It is spirit, which knows itself as the universal essence and reality. The state is the reality of the kingdom of heaven. And finally, the state is Allah's will. That's a frightening sort of parallel there with Hegel's statements, which seem very Islamic.
Now, it's very Islamic, but keep in mind that what I am describing here, there is no caliphate yet. But these ideas, the idea that the leader has supreme power, total power, messianic power, is already there. But it will take some decades and centuries for Islam to take shape and to present itself as you are describing it.
Yeah. But the precursors are there. It's just interesting that these are old ideas. They are repackaged, but it's always these same ideas that keep coming back in some form or another.
Yeah, I think so. It's also Edouard Marie Gallet's theology, and he actually worked on the idea of salvation. He thinks, and I agree with him, that this idea was invented by Jesus and spread by the first Christians, and they were very quickly. There were two major change that were made to the Christian ideas. There was the idea that founded Gnosticism, the idea that one could save oneself by oneself without the help of Jesus. So salvation for individual salvation, sort of. And there was the idea of a collective salvation. The idea that it derives from, it has drifted from the teaching of Jesus when he said he would come back at the end of the world, at the end of times, not the end of the world, but the end of times. And he would sort of cleanse the world from evil. And in groups, and according to Edouard Marie Gallet's work, in the Judeo-Nazarene group, which emerged in the 1st century from the very early Jerusalem Christian community, there was this idea that Jesus would come back at the end of times to physically cleanse the world from evil, meaning killing all the evildoers, all the people who did not abide by the law. This is the very idea of Islam, actually, because the people that start to sing this way, they also sing that they can help Jesus in this task. They can help him come faster, for example, by rebuilding the temple. And they will also be his auxiliaries in his army. They will be his ministers, his generals, and they will be Ansar Allah, auxiliaries of God, God's auxiliary. This is the idea of Islam. This is very present within Islam.
within rabbinic Judaism, there is the belief, for instance, that if people can be encouraged to follow the law thoroughly for just 30 minutes, this will mean that the world will be purified and that the Messiah will come back. This actually is a legitimate Jewish belief, to my knowledge, and this is kind of what you have within Islam is an extension of that idea. So it is derived from a Jewish idea. So certainly there's that parallel there.
This Jewish idea has come into Islam through the Judeo-Nazarene movement. The Judeo-Nazarenes were Jews. They were opposed to rabbinic Judaism because they recognized Jesus as Israel's Messiah. And because of this, they were opposed to the death to rabbinic Jews. But they were also opposed to Christians because for them, Jesus was not the God himself. He could be described as Son of God, but not as God himself. And so they also opposed Christians. But let me go back to the presentation and to the point I wanted to make here is that those various Arab factions that fought among themselves, they had collected the Arabic notes from the time of the Arab prophetism movements. They had notes from the preacher of the early movements. And they were the only Arabic literature they could have at the time because the Arabs did not have books. And they preserved these notes and they served as a sort of legitimization for them. And this is important to bear in mind because the Quran, the future Quran, will come from this. But let me go to the next step. The next step, I've already told it, is when Abdul Malik managed to impose his rule over all factions, almost all factions. It happened in 685, and Abdul Malik was an immense character in human history. So he was very strong, and by his skills as a general and as a head of state, he managed to sort of unite all factions under his rule. And he had this genius that he should not bluntly oppose the other faction. You see, the various contestants, the various contestants,
contenders would be a
by
word.
claiming one claimed, I am the intermediary between God and man, and another came and said, I am God's envoy. And they sort of oppose themselves like this. What Abdul Malik did is he took every previous religious claim for himself. Instead of opposing the others, he said, I rule in the name of God. I am the intermediary between God and man. I am the Mahmad. I am God's envoy, and so on. And he added a new claim. This new claim was, I am God's deputy on earth. This is very important. God's deputy on earth, Khalifat Allah, God's caliph. He is the first one to mint coins with this claim, Khalifat Allah, God's deputy, Khalifat Allah al-Ard, God's deputy on earth, which means actually caliph doesn't mean successor. The Islamic narrative has transformed, distorted the meaning of the word so that it would refer to Muhammad. The caliph is supposed to be a caliph of Muhammad, a successor of Muhammad. Whereas Abdul Malik claims the title Khalifat Allah al-Ard, God's deputy on earth. So there is no connection to Muhammad or to any former prophet. He claims to be he claims to have been chosen directly by God, so he claims to be God's envoy, to establish the caliphate on earth. And what is the caliphate? It is a place where God's deputy is ruling. So he establishes a sort of God's kingdom on earth and he enforces God's rule on earth. This is very important because this is exactly what the Arabs were expecting. They were expecting a Messiah to come back from heaven and to establish God's kingdom and enforce God's rule. And what we see at the end of the 7th century is one man doing so and acting so and minting coins with the inscription, "I am God's deputy on earth."
What does this mean that he's usurping Jesus's authority? Is there a possibility of that?
Yes, exactly. I think so because when you look at the inscription in the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock is a monument that Abdul Malik built around 692. And there are very ancient inscriptions inside. And some of them, I believe, date from Abdul Malik himself. And in this inscription, he speaks about Jesus and himself. He speaks of him as being an equivalent to Jesus. He claims the same title as Jesus. I explain this
Messiah
in my book.
To the Arabs.
Excuse me, Lloyd. I didn't get
like
you.
A Messiah to the Arabs.
Exactly. He is the actual Messiah. And so it means that there is no need for Jesus anymore to come back now. So the second coming of Jesus is pushed back to another end of times. And if you look into it, if you look into the Islamic narrative, you find traditions about the coming of Jesus at the end of times. Some traditions are very odd because he is supposed to come back on Abdul Malik's mosque in Damascus. The earliest layers of the tradition say that Jesus is supposed to come back, the Messiah is supposed to come back in Jerusalem. And I think the Umayyads, especially Abdul Malik, invented the idea that Jesus would come back in his city, in his capital, in Damascus, in his mosque, which is a way of saying Jesus is mine. Jesus obeys me. I am the Messiah you need now. And when Jesus will come back in centuries.
So this is man become God, which is very much atheist doctrine as well as socialist doctrine. And Mary Alex says here, Muslims seem to be desperate for Christ, which is, I'd say, correct, because they seem to have developed an entire theology around Christ, and yet they deny Christ. It's insane.
What's very, very important at the time, Abdul Malik sort of, you see, before Abdul Malik, the various Arab leaders and the Arabs that fought among themselves, they were seen as Christians, and they were kind of Christians. They were apocalyptic Christians. They were deviant Christians. But with Abdul Malik, we start to have something else. Because Abdul Malik claims his power comes directly from God. He doesn't need Jesus anymore. He doesn't need the Bible and the biblical context anymore. And he insists on the Arabness of his power. He is the one who creates an empire where the administration speaks Arabic. Whereas before, during Muawiyah's time, for example, the administration, the civil servants, they spoke Greek in the Levant, in the West, and in the East, in Mesopotamia, they spoke Aramaic or Persian.
But here they created a new identity. They created a separate identity to give them an individual identity.
if you look at Robert Hoyland's book,
Dominion or
in God's
oh,
Past,
okay.
in his conclusion, he put forth a very interesting idea. He says that Abdul Malik founded something new, a new empire that had two legs, sort of. One leg was the former Byzantine colonies in the West, and another leg was a big piece of the former Persian Empire. So it was both Byzantine and Persian. And the only and so you see when should the Persian part of the empire have gotten too much influence, it would be balanced by the Byzantine part, by the Mediterranean part. And the same in the other way. Should the Mediterranean part, the Greek part of the empire, takes too much importance, it would be balanced by the Persian part. And so the new empire that he founded never became completely Greek or completely Persian. If you look in history, we have, for example, the kingdom of the Franks in the 5th century. There was a Frank leader who was a former Roman officer and who took power in Gaul and who founded the Frank kingdom. So he himself was kind of German or Germanic.
Mm-hmm.
But by founding his kingdom within the limits of the former Roman, Western Roman Empire, his kingdom lost its Germanic identity and sort of fused with the cultural influence of the Roman Empire. In the end, the Frankish language was forgotten, and people spoke Latin. And his new kingdom was sort of absorbed into the Roman Empire, the cultural influence of the Roman Empire. Whereas the new caliphate, because it had these two legs, it never got absorbed. One part, it never got reabsorbed in the former empires. This is something very interesting, and also it pinpointed the Arabicness identity he gave to his empire, because it shows Arabic as the official language. Because he forced every civil servant to speak and use Arabic, he gave a new identity to his empire, which explains, in Robert Hoyland's conclusion, why it endured so much, why his empire was never conquered by Byzantium or was never conquered by forces from the east. What he also did, Abdul Malik, is gathering all the notes, the Arabic notes, the note collection from the various Arab factions that he submitted. And he mixed those notes together. He made a sort of potpourri, and he redacted it a bit and edited his own collection, the future Quran. And this was a genius invention, because by putting forth his own collection and destroying everything that was not his own collection, he forced every faction to recognize his collection as the legit one. And also because he had mixed and intertwined every collection from the faction he submitted, the various factions could not recognize their own collection within Abdul Malik's collection. They were forced to take everything, including the notes from the rival factions. And this was a way for Abdul Malik to impose himself on all the factions he submitted. And this is also explain why the Quran is so strange, so odd. Why all the narratives are sort of cut into little bits and mixed together and intertwined. Why is it so odd? And I think it's because Abdul Malik did it on purpose, so that no one could claim this chapter comes from me or from my faction. This was a genius threat.
Right.
And you see that with Abdul Malik, we have something new. So we have a sort of Messiah king or King Messiah, the Caliph, who claims to be God's envoy, and his successors, so his sons and the other successor, will justify their own claim to power with Abdul Malik's legacy, with the connection they had with him. But we see that the farther away you will get from Abdul Malik, the more difficult it will be for his successor to justify the claim by saying, I am the successor to Abdul Malik, I am the successor to the Mahmad. They will need much stronger legitimation. And so his remote successor, and especially the Abbasid, would have to invent a direct divine legitimation for their power. And I will come back to this point in detail. And this is very important. You see, Abdul Malik did not need a divine revelation to justify his claim to power. He was so powerful that it was evident, it was blatant for everyone, or at least for his mu'minun. It was easy to believe that God had sent him. But his remote successors, and especially the Abbasids, who fought against his successors, who fought against the Umayyads, who slaughtered almost every Umayyad, they could not claim a legitimation for their own power as caliphs by stating a connection with Abdul Malik and the Umayyads. And so the Abbasid especially, they were in dire need for a divine legitimation.
Would you say there's an element of private revelation here at play?
I didn't get to your point, Lloyd. Excuse me.
Is there any aspect of private revelation coming to play here? Because Christianity is a religion based on public revelation, not, oh, I'm having these personal, direct conversations with God, and God told me this, and I'm now the new leader of Christianity, and everyone has to listen to me. Is Abdul Malik sort of leaning in that direction with private revelation?
No. Abdul Malik, there was no need for any revelation for
political
Abdul Malik.
Power.
Why would he have need a revelation? His own power was blatant enough to show everyone that God had chosen him, that he was God envoy.
Okay, because that is actually also Hegel's position on socialism, that the fact of being in authority is the indication that God has chosen you to be in authority. So the fact of having power is indication of the divine right to be in power, which is a very circular argument, but that is literally Hegel's argument for the validity of socialist government.
Yeah,
so
Islam.
The parallel is just very interesting to me.
Also. Yeah? In Islam, there is a sort of Muslim worship power, actually. A scholar friend of mine told me that Islam is force. What makes Islam is brute force, power, force. There is this idea of God and the Prophet and the Quran and so on, but in the end, and basically, Islam is power. It is the worshipping of power. And thanks for your remark. Hegel shows us the way once again. But let's go back to the Abbasids and the late Umayyads and the Abbasids. They were the one who needed more legitimation for their power. They needed something more because they were not as charismatic or powerful as Abdul Malik. They could not claim that God had chosen them directly. And so they needed a revelation, a divine revelation that would appoint them as the divine rulers of the caliphate. They needed a revelation that would say God has given power to a prophet to be the ruler of the world, and we are the successor of this prophet. When you need a revelation, you need a prophet, and you also need a book or something to contain the revelation. You also need an history and so on. And the Abbasid were the one who invented the whole of Islam. They wrote the Islamic narrative to justify their claim. They invented Muhammad as the prophet, being given a divine revelation, who gave him authority to found the Islamic State, to found Islam, and so the Caliph could claim that they were Muhammad's successor, and they invented Islam to justify their rule, actually. And this is what I want to develop now. But just before, I want to address one of the first commentaries about Islam being an heresy of an heresy. If you look at this timetable, there are 4 major steps, and this is what is sometimes odd with Islam, is that we don't understand Islam because we see it through the Islamic narrative, and we don't understand it because we don't have the 4 steps. The 4 steps are very important. If you look up to the 3rd step, we are still up to the 2nd step, let's say, we are still in a biblical context, a Christian-like context. So those Arabs, the movements they were in were sort of heresies. They were heresies, actual Christian heresies. But with Abdul Malik and with the Abbasids, one cannot speak about heresy because the links, the connection with Christianity has been severed. It's something completely new that emerged at the time. And because of this, because we miss the first part, we miss what happened during the earliest of Islam, we don't understand that Islam comes from Christianity, actually, comes from Christian ideas, deviant Christian ideas. But let's focus now on the invention of Islam and its narrative. I want to develop exactly this part. The Islam part, his remote successors and the Abbasid invent a direct divine legitimation. I told you they needed a direct divine legitimation for their rule, for the caliphal rule, that would legitimize the Arabs as God's new chosen people and their ruler as God's deputy on earth. They needed something that would be independent from the original Jewish and Christian context. They needed something that would also not rely on Abdul Malik's legacy.
Odon, can you remove that label from the screen? I don't know if you can see it, but it's overlying the PowerPoint. It's in French, and it's if you go back to the studio, when you share your screen, it adds yes.
Okay,
thank you.
I've done it.
Awesome. Yeah.
Sorry, should have done it earlier. I did not see it. So they needed something, a legitimation that did not rely on Abdul Malik's legacy. And so they required a prophet, a new prophet, that would also be a ruler sent by God to provide a divine revelation, and whose succession would be the basis for the caliph's legitimacy. And in order to explain all of this, they needed a narrative, a new narrative to explain the story. And this is why and how the Islamic narrative was created. Let's look now at the process. How was the Islamic narrative invented? So there was this idea that there was a need for a prophet. And so there was a foundational layer as a starting point. There was an Arab prophet sent by God who received a divine revelation that granted divine authority to the Arabs and their leader, the caliph, leading to their rise to power. So this is the foundational layer. And on this layer, starting from this, there was a logic of backward construction. You see, they started from the conclusion. The conclusion is God has chosen us to be the divine rulers on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And starting from this conclusion, they invented artificial premises to justify the conclusion. So they invented, for example, the story of the revelation and the prophet's actions. But doing this way, they also had to keep in mind very significant constraints. They could not invent their story from scratch. They couldn't invent anything about the prophet. They had to take into account what already happened. They had to build upon the previous religious inventions during the fitna. So they had to make do with the Muhammad title. They had to make do with the motto, the formula, Muhammad Rasulullah. They had to make do also, and they were happy to do to have it with the God's deputy title. They also had to fill the various gaps in the story they were inventing. For example, they had to invent a place of origin for the prophet. They had to invent a background context.
Mm-hmm.
They had to invent plausible stories also to explain the inventions.
They also had to erase some history that's very uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. They had to provide Islamic explanation for every remnant of the actual history. They had to reinterpret, for example, the meaning of buildings, such as the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock was originally built by Abdul Malik to celebrate his own power. In the Islamic narrative, the Dome of...
Sorry?
Yeah, in the Islamic narrative, the Dome of the Rock is supposed to commemorate the night journey of the Prophet. So they invented something to explain the building because they could not destroy the building. But they also
Sorry, but the style of the Dome of the Rock...
Feel free to interrupt me.
It's just that you're making me think of I have these, as is common, you're filling in blanks and gaps and making connecting dots of things that I've also learned myself. And the Dome of the Rock is developed in the style of a church, specifically from the 4th century Byzantine Church of the Kathisma, which is dedicated to Mary. And the original Church of the Kathisma was at one point co-opted by the Muslims and used as one of these ecumenical worship sites with Jews, Christians, and Muslims. I mean, for given values of the word Christian and the word Jew, right? And then, of course, you have this this church eventually was leveled. It was leveled and buried, which is not uncommon, because I want to show everyone something in a moment. But so here you have what seems to be originally a church that's now being repurposed for a completely different purpose. And if
it's a very interesting point you're making, Lloyd.
Thank you.
Because the Kathisma Church was converted into a mosque.
Yes.
And so it was used by Muslims as a mosque. But there was a time, the time when it was leveled. Why was it leveled? It was a mosque. Why level a mosque? I think it was leveled because at the time they invented the stories about the night journey, and they invented a new explanation for the Dome of the Rock. And because
Yeah.
of this, they couldn't bear to have two almost identical buildings. The Dome of the Rock had to be unique. And so
Yeah.
this is why I think they leveled the Katisma
Good. That's
Mosque.
a fantastic solution, and thank you for that. I was wondering about that, and now you've just given me an answer, and I appreciate that. That's amazing. Thank you very much, Cargo Crew, for the super sticker. And I just want to mention something related to, but also a discussion in the comments. But also, this is Jubail. I've been to Jubail a couple of times in Saudi Arabia as part of my work,
Mhm,
and notice this is in Saudi Arabia, where you see lots of these symbols, right, Odon?
mhm.
These symbols come around in Saudi Arabia all the time. This little thing with 4 points, like a vertical bar and a horizontal bar. That's a very Islamic symbol. And so someone's going to complain in the comments later, Lloyd, I struggle to understand your sarcasm. It's very hard for me to concentrate, and I have to wonder whether you're making a joke or being sarcastic or being serious. And I struggle to determine which that is. So anyway, but this is from what, the 4th century. It's an Assyrian church, which tells us that Christianity was rife. And this is one of many. Here's an example of another church in the UAE buried. And this is
Mhm.
not this is one of several examples that are being found lately. Archaeology is discovering more and more evidence of Christianity that is all across the Middle East. So there was a lot of Christianity going around. It wasn't like Islam developed in this vacuum of nothing. No, there was Christianity, there was heresy, and Islam developed out of a rich culture of Christian ideas, even if they were heretical Christian ideas.
If
Well,
you, it is one of the many oddities and discrepancy of the Islamic narrative. They invented this idea that the whole religion, Islam, was sort of founded out of nothing. They invented this. They needed this for their narrative to be coherent. But when you look into it, it cannot be. Never in history has anyone founded a religion from nothing. If you look at Christianity, Jesus was, of course, the central figure, but he dwelled in a Jewish context with an history, with texts, with an anthropology also, a language, a set of minds. And these things, Jesus could not have created them. If you look at, I don't know, if you look at Joseph Smith, for example, the founder of Mormonism, he relied on the religious mind of his time. He did not create the need for a prophet, for example, in his audience. It's because his audience at the time in the 19th century in the US was already religious, and they were already acquainted with the Bible and the idea that prophets could come and utter God's word. And when you look at Islam, we have something that cannot be. A prophet who comes out of nothing, out of paganism, and who
mhm.
creates a whole religion, a whole biblical religion, because the Quran is biblical, out of nothing. So this example, this is a good example of an incoherence in the Islamic narrative that tells us how it was created, that it was invented, actually. But let me go back to the presentation. So the narrative had to provide an Islamic explanation for everything that remained from actual history. So buildings, names of people, names of places, and it had to make do with collective memories. This is very important. The people sort of remembered what happened in the 7th century. They remembered, for example, that the Arabs themselves, they remembered that Jerusalem was a focus point. So when they were inventing the Islamic narrative, they had to provide an Islamic explanation for the focus on Jerusalem. And this is what they did by inventing the night journey story. And this way, they invented stories and stories and stories. But the main process was giving an Islamic explanation to the Quran. They were sort of forced to use Abdul Malik's Quran as the support for the revelation. And so they had to reinterpret this text in an Islamic context. And they had to invent stories that would fit the existing text, that to creatively reinterpret the text so that it would tell Islam. And this is something very important and very strange within Islam. The actual literary meaning of the Quran is not Islamic.
It's to proclaim. It's Qira. It's the Jewish term again.
Yeah. The very name of the Quran is not Arabic and is not Islamic. And if you look into it, the Quran is actually a pre-Islamic text, a proto-Islamic text. There are some ideas within the Quran that really fit Islam, about God and about the Messiah and about lots of stuff. But when you look into it, the Quran doesn't describe Islam. What makes it into an Islamic text is the external Islamic literature that was written afterwards, and that gives the text is meaning. Without the external literature, without the Sirah, without the life of the Prophet, without the circumstance of the revelation, you cannot understand the Quran in an Islamic way. You have to rely on external Islamic literature for this. This is why there cannot be Quranism, for example. Muslims that wants to get rid of every external Islamic literature and claim to rely on the Quran only. Because in the end, the concept, for example, of a prophet giving a revelation is not in the Quran per se. The concept, the story of Muhammad being expelled from Mecca, arriving in Medina, gathering people there, and going back to conquer Mecca, it's not in the Quran, actually. If you really look at it literally, it isn't written in the Quran. It's written in the external literature. And this was a very, very important process for Islam, taking every verse of the Quran and giving it an Islamic reinterpretation. And by doing so...
It's repeating the Bible, badly, but it is effectively retelling biblical themed tales to an audience that it assumes knows these stories. Mm-hmm. So this is really interesting, and it never mentions Muhammad by name as such. And it mentions what? Jesus is mentioned 81 times, and Muhammad as the title is mentioned once, maybe 4 times if you count it that way.
4 times.
Yeah, well, if you count it that way, but technically I think it's once, and then 4 you can stretch it, and Jesus is mentioned 81 plus times, and the only woman mentioned is Mary.
There is something here I need to say it.
Sure.
Every mention of Muhammad in the Quran is an interpolation. It was added later. This has been proven by Edouard Marie-Galès in his thesis, and also in an article in a conference during the 2019 INARA meeting in Germany. So the 4 mentions, the 4 Muhammad mentioned, and also the Ahmad mentioned, are interpolations. They were added later in the Quran, which means that they were not here at the beginning. It tells us something. Why did the traditionists and the servants of the caliphs why did they have the need to add Muhammad in the Quran? Muhammad as the prophet. He tells us that Muhammad is an invention. Muhammad as an Islamic prophet is an invention.
Yeah, I want to say thank you to Mary Alex as well for that donation. Thank you very kindly, much appreciated. It really does go a long way. You'd be surprised how it does. And yeah, welcome Islamic Origins. Mal is in the house. Everyone, say hello, please. We've got
Hello,
Mal
Mel.
here. So
Hello, Mel.
yeah, and thanks.
Nice
And
to
guys,
have you.
please do keep the comments generally on topic. It's really distracting when you guys go off topic. And I've put someone on timeout for 30 minutes earlier because they were ranting about something unrelated. So yeah, please stay roughly on topic. Back to you, Odon.
Yeah, you see the process, the fabrication of the Islamic narrative also produced a cascade of discrepancies. I've pointed at some already, and the the servants of the caliphs, the traditionists, they had to address these discrepancies, and this was also a major constraint for the creation of the Islamic narrative. When there was a discrepancy, an incoherence that was too blatant to be left, they had to address it and to correct the stories or to make new inventions. I will give example of this, and this is, in my opinion, how the Islamic narrative was invented. It was a gradual invention, building layer upon layers of invention and correcting the former layers and rebuilding. But let's get now into some details. The first one is the Prophet himself. The Prophet had to be named Muhammad. Why exactly? Why?
Well, historical use of the word Muhammad goes back to at least the 4th century, and it was being used by Christians to refer either to God, which was the original usage, or to Jesus in one or two cases. And it's in inscriptions in Arabia, so they had to use a term that was common knowledge. And they had to supplant Jesus. They want to
I
replace
get your
Jesus.
point, Lloyd, but it's not what I want to say here. You see, when the Abbasids wanted to invent their prophet, they had to make do with former history. And Abdul Malik took for himself the title Muhammad. And his successors, they called themselves successor of Muhammad because they were successor of Abdul Malik. And so the Abbasids, who wanted to take the God's deputy title, they had to be called also successors of Muhammad. So it meant that for them, they had to invent a prophet that had to be named Muhammad. And by doing so, they were forced to take into account the historical character that were nicknamed Muhammad in the 7th century. And because they were sort of forced to use the Muhammad name, the Muhammad nickname, they had to make do with the distant memories of the historical character in the beginning of the 7th century that bore the Muhammad title. The Qurayshi leader who is described, for example, in the Pseudo-Sibeos. He existed. He is described as being named Mahmet. There were memories about him. Still, he was not a prophet of Islam. He was an apocalyptic Christian, Judeo-Christian preacher who wanted to urge Arabs into conquering Jerusalem. But there were memories about him, and they had to make do with this. And so, because of this, they also had to make do with the other armed prophets, the other people who claimed to be the precursors of the Messiah. And so they had to, they took the memories of this distant figure into the kitchen where they cooked the new Muhammad. They were taken, this memory was taken, distorted, rewritten to fit the new Muhammad character. And by doing so, the prophet's successor became also Khalifat Muhammad. They gave a new meaning to the expression Khalifat Muhammad that the Umayyad successors of Abdul Malik took for themselves, because they were Khalifat of successors, deputy of Abdul Malik. And we see this in the sources, in the Islamic sources. Patricia Crone and Martin Hinz, they wrote a book called God's Caliph, and they state in this book that before the Abbasid, there was no caliph who bore the title Khalifat Rasulullah, or Khalif, and it's only with the Abbasid that we see the title Khalifat Rasulullah appear. It tells us something about the invention of the reinterpretation of the caliph title. And besides every mention, excuse me, this is I'm missing the point. By basing sort of, by using the historical Muhammad, the historical Mahmad, who was a Qurayshi, it also oriented the narrative toward the Qurayshi tribe. Since they were forced to use the memories of the Qurayshi leader, of the historical Muhammad, because of this Qurayshi-led conquest, had to become the driving force of the new narrative for early Islam and the early conquest. So the Quraysh tribe was sort of put forth because of this. They did not, when you look into it, the Abbasid caliphs did not need the Qurayshi memories, but they had to make do with them. And because it shows the historical Muhammad, they were forced to Qurayshize their narrative.
Yeah.
And by adding Mahmad as a name, it also meant for them that every former mention of Mahmad had to become Islamicized. And, for example, you have here the gold coin is one of the early coins of Abdul Malik. There is around his figure the phrase Muhammad Rasulullah, Mahmad Rasulullah. And so this expression was reinterpreted as not referring to Abdul Malik, but referring to the new Islamic prophet. You understand the thing?
Yeah.
You get my point.
Yeah.
But
no,
they could
add
not
something
do
to this? Can I just add? Can I make a historical note here? If you go back in that region, in southern Arabia, there were a group of rulers originally called the Muqarribba. Then you had the Muqminin, but the Muqarribba, they were effectively like caliphs. It was a priest king, a warrior priest king that had to make war, that made war. So that concept made its way into Islam, thousands or over 1,000 years later. But it was too much associated with paganism and the previous cultures. Then you had the Muqminin, but that was too much associated with Christianity and Judaism, or with the biblical context. Then they became the caliph. But something that I was hoping to get to by now, which I have not, is that the idea of the caliph, or the caliphate, the region, the political entity of a caliphate, not the caliph himself, but the political region of the caliphate, is very much derived from Platonic philosophy, where Plato talks about in his Politeia of having the perfect world, but you can't do that if just your little village is perfect, because that has no impact on the wider world. So you have to spread this ideology, this perfect ideology, across the whole world. Then you can have a perfect world with perfect people. So that ideology is based on a fairly, well, I mean, in some senses accurate, in other senses also corrupted use of Greek philosophy, which is also, I mean, the underpinnings of socialism. So it's really interesting that these philosophies all just tie together. It's all, it really. I'll pause there. Back to you.
With you, Lloyd, we always come back to socialism and Hegel. But
no, I mean, Hegel is something I discovered today. That was
right,
a link I
right,
discovered today. I've been looking for 2 years. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But you're completely right. There is the same idea in socialism in Hegel than the one we find in early Islam and Islam.
And in Politeia by Plato, it's weird. It's the same bad ideas in different packaging.
Anyhow, let me just conclude the presentation over this slide by saying that what actually happened in early Islam was much more complex than what the Islamic narrative has changed and reinterpreted it. There were various movements. There were several Arab factions, but because they had to choose one prophet, and they had to choose the leader of the Qurayshis, the other leaders were deemed anti-prophets, and everything came back to the Qurayshis. And when they had to invent places and fill the gaps, when they had to invent a new place, they had to we saw this in our previous presentation, they had to transfer the setting of Islam from the settings of the Qurayshi to Mecca. The Qurayshi were set in Syria, actually, and a bit in northern Mesopotamia also, but we have found evidence of their presence in Syria. And when they needed to invent a new place of origin, when they invented Mecca as a blank page to support their new history, they transferred the setting of they transferred the setting of the Qurayshi tribe, but they sort of resumed Islam to the Qurayshi movement, whereas early Islam was much more complex than this, and so they, in order to fill the gaps of the narrative they were creating, they needed this blank page. And so they found this in Mecca. I believe that Mecca was already, I don't know whether there was a settlement there, but there is no water in Mecca, so nothing can thrive there. Maybe there was something, maybe a halting site because there was a well. Maybe it was a halting site for a herder with goats, but there cannot have been a big settlement there. But the interesting point with Mecca is that it was in a desert, remote from everything. It was free from Jewish and Christian influences. So you could invent everything there. You could invent a pagan background, for example. And I also believe that during Abdul Malik's time, when he put forth the Arabness of his religious movements, I believe that during his time, or maybe his direct successor, they had to invent an Arab place for Abraham. You see, there was something about Jerusalem that did not fit the views of Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik claimed to be the new Messiah chosen by God. And there was a connection with Abraham's story, because his creed in God was still founded in the Bible. but he needed Abraham to be more Arab than Jewish and Christian. And in order to have a sort of Arab Abraham, to Arabize Abraham and Arabize Ishmael, he had to transfer Abraham into an Arab place. You see, when you look at the Islamic narrative about Mecca, they could not have created Mecca from scratch, completely from scratch. It was also a gradual invention. There was a first layer, which was to state that the Mecca was the place of Abraham, that the actual place of Abraham was not in Jerusalem with the Christians and the Jews, but it must be in an Arab place, far from the influences of Judaism and Christianity. And upon this first layer, upon the first layer of the Abrahamic significance of Mecca, they built the idea that it was the setting of the tribe of the prophet. You see, there were several inventions, layers of inventions here.
Mm-hmm.
And
We just had a super chat from Corolla97 who says, great overview from Odon. So yeah, thank you again, Odon, for this. This is really interesting. I mean, it's very interesting.
I hope everyone can understand me. I know I have a very thick accent, and it's difficult for some. I try to concentrate it and speak the best English I can, but if you don't understand something, or Lloyd, if you want me to repeat something or to be more clear or to have a better pronunciation, don't hesitate to interrupt me.
It's what it is. I'm trying not to interrupt you very much either. I don't want to interrupt you all the time either. You know, that's also bad. But people really enjoying it. Brilliant presentation, Odon. Bravo. And I think it's creating a lot of conversational buzz. So really, it's getting people thinking. It's really thought-provoking, honestly. I'm finding it very sensible, very logical, very rational.
It is thought-provoking. For someone, Muslim or not, no Muslim or not Muslim, non-Muslim, who discovers this for the first time, it is a bit groundbreaking. But that the way things are, the Islamic narrative is a complete invention, fabrication. Mm-hmm. And when we study it with a critical mind, we see all the oddities, the incoherences, the discrepancies that are clues to understand the how it was fabricated, what the process was. We understand that there were layers, for example, and that they sort of try to correct the discrepancies and the oddities and the incoherences from the former layers before building a new layers upon the former layer. And we see this also because they left evidence for the process of fabrication. For example, there is evidence that the actual Qurayshi tribe setting was in northwestern Syria and not in the Hijaz, because we already saw this together last week, Lloyd, but I've put it here also, because we have evidence. There was archaeological evidence of the presence of the Qurayshi in northwestern Syria near Latakia, Al-Ladikia in Arabic. This map is taken from Edouard Marie Gallet's book, Le Messie et son prophète, his thesis from 2004. And he used the research of a French Orientalist, epigrapher, geographer, René Dussault, who published a book about the geography and the names of the places of ancient Syria. And thanks to this, he found here the Khan el-Qurashiyeh, Here you see this with the arrow. Khan el-Qurashiyeh means halting site of the Qurayshi tribe, or inn of the Qurayshi tribe, or caravanserai of the Qurayshi tribe. This place still existed in the 1920s when René Dussault went to Syria to make his to make his work as a geographer. It is this place is there is a river that flows just beside this place that is called the River of the Qurayshis, Nahr el Quraysh. When you look at ancient map, you also find that there were places named with the Qurayshi name. There
Does it
was
derive
Ras
from
Korash.
Cyrus? What is the derivation of Qureshi? Could it be Koresh from Cyrus?
We don't know. Mel had this hypothesis of Quraysh being derived from Cyrus, the Persian Empire, which could mean that the Qurayshi tribe came from Persia. We have reports in ancient sources of the Qurayshi tribe also being settled in northern Mesopotamia. So a bit nearer the Persian Empire.
Mm-hmm. You know, remember I mentioned that first century, the book of Al-Chasai and the prophet Al-Chasai, that very first century heresy, this sort of pseudo-biblical heresy, it also stems from Persia. And this is maybe just a thought to put out there. You know, Nag Hammadi, where we get all of the Gnostic Gospels from, Hammadi is actually a diminutive of Muhammad, and Nag means distinguished. So this tells me that perhaps this is the idea of Gnosticism is reminiscent of Muhammad. You know, so they've placed all of these things in Nag Hammadi to remind them that these references, these Gnostic tales, are all from Muhammad. I just found it a really odd coincidence that Gnosticism, the root source of Gnosticism in modern times, comes from a place related to Muhammad's name. I just found it very odd.
An odd coincidence, yeah. I agree. But we also find the truth about the Qurayshi tribe setting being in Syria. We also find it in the Islamic literature. There was a 12th century Muslim scholar, Yaqut al-Hamawi, who wrote that the people who lived in the region of the Khan el-Qurashiyeh were Banu Quraysh, sons of Qurayshi, were Qurayshis. So in the 12th century, it was during at the end of the Crusades. He was riding in the coattails of Saladin, and it was Saladin who asked him about the people living there, and he answered after having made his inquiries that they were Banu Quraysh. So it's something it has been forgotten that the Quraysh were originally from northwestern Syria, but the evidence is still there, and the Islamic narrative cannot make with this evidence. This evidence shows that there is something wrong with the Islamic narrative, that there is something wrong with the idea of the Qurayshi tribe stemming from the Hijaz, where there is absolutely no trace of them. There is no river of the Qurayshis in the Hijaz. There are no places with names linked to the Qurayshis. And besides, if you look at the map, there are also names that are very interesting. There is an Abu Qubais here in Syria. There is an Abil Bet Makkah here.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that these names were actually taken from northwestern Syria and assigned to new places in the Hijaz region so as to distort the memories. This is the thing I was telling you about. There was a collective memory of what happened in the 7th century. People, the Arabs, remembered that the Qurayshi had a place named Abu Qubais. They remembered that there was something about a Makkah name. And so when they invented Mecca and the new as a new place for the origins of Islam and the origins of the Prophet, they distorted the memory by transferring those names to the new places. You see, you cannot erase a collective memory. You can destroy a text. You can level a building. But if you want to destroy a collective memory, you have to kill every person who has the story in mind. So the best way to make do with a collective memory is to distort it, to add new memories, to invent new stories, so as to change the meaning of the memory. You change the place. You cannot change the name Abu Qubais. Okay, let's change the place then, and put Abu Qubais near Mecca. This is how they created the Islamic narrative. Let's get now to the major constraint and the central process that shaped Islam and Islamic history, which was Islamicizing the Quran. Like I told you, the Quran had to be Islamicized so as to be the support of the new revelation, which means that every verse had to be reinterpreted into a new narrative, the new narrative. For example, the Quran talks about the temple in Jerusalem. It talks about the pilgrimage in Jerusalem, the Hajj. It talks about Jerusalem premises. It talks about the hills of Safa and Marwa that are in Jerusalem. Safa is Mount Sophain, near the Mount of Olive. Marwa is Mount Moriah, which is the Temple Mount. And so they reinterpreted what they found in the Quran by forcefully referring to new places or new customs, new things in Mecca. They also invented places, names for places to align with the text. If you take, for example, Mount Arafat, which is nowadays near Mecca, the name has been given to this mount because in the text, I don't remember the exact reference, there is a strange word with Arafat, and they invented that it was the name of a mount, and they gave this name to a mount near Mecca. Everything was reinterpreted. They attributed the authorship of the Quran to the Prophet, to Muhammad. In order to Islamicize the Quran, so they added Muhammad verses in the Quran, like I told you, plus the Ahmad mention. They reinterpreted the mention of a Rasul in the text as referring to Muhammad. Rasul doesn't mean Muhammad, doesn't mean Islamic prophet. Rasul in Arabic, it means apostle, envoy. It can refer to Jesus, it can refer to a biblical prophet. It can also refer to anyone who has been given a mission, who has been envoyed, who has been sent. Another key, another central issue in Islamicizing the Quran was forcefully changing the meanings of key meanings in the Quran. There are expressions that the Islamic narrative completely reinterpreted it. For example, the Nazarenes, Nasara in Arabic, originally referred to the Judeo-Nazarenes. In the Islamic narrative, they became Christians. When you look in the Quranic text, you see many occurrences of the word Quran. Quran literally meaning lectionary. It does not literally mean Islamic word of God or Islamic book uttered by Muhammad, the prophet sent by God. It means lectionary, and its original meaning was to refer to an Arabic Judeo-Nazarene Bible lectionary, which is another book, which is not the Islamic Quran. It is a book that was made by the Judeo-Nazarene to convert the Arabs to their religion. And in the Quran, we have many relations of a preacher praising this book, so the Arabic Judeo-Nazarene Bible lectionary, to his audience, so as in order for his audience to adopt it as his new lectionary. The Islamic narrative has completely changed the meaning of Quran. It has completely forgotten about the Judeo-Nazarenes and the original Quran, the original Bible lectionary, and it changed the name into God's revelation in the form of the Quran, and it completely changes the meaning of the text. When you read the Quran with the original meaning in mind, it completely changes. It uncovers the real history. And it's something very, very interesting to do. This is what I done in my book. In the last part of my book, I explain how I take a selection of verses and I explain the Islamic meaning, the Islamic interpretation of the verse, and I also give the literal meaning of the verse. So an Islamic explanation with the word Quran would be that the Quran is God's revelation in the form of the Quran, and the literal explanation is that it is not the Islamic Quran, but something else. It was this Bible lectionary that was translated into Arabic. There are many, many expressions that have been changed, whose meaning has been changed by the Islamic narrative, such as mushrikun, associator, mushrikun. Literally, it referred to Christians, and it became pagan in the Islamic narrative. The temple, Bayt, al-Bayt, mostly in the Quranic text, it literally means Jerusalem temple. Sometimes it also means house. Literally, Bayt means house. But the Islamic narrative, when it aligned with this motivation, with its purpose, it changed the meaning of the word into Kaaba, and therefore, because of this, the meaning of the text is completely changed, and this is how they managed to have a text that was initially about Jerusalem, about the temple in Jerusalem. They managed to have this text referring to Mecca, the temple in Mecca, the Kaaba, the region of Mecca, and so on. Right. And this is really, really a tour de force. This is something that was not easy. It took centuries to make such
which would explain why, if you look at the Sirat Rasulullah, right, the biographies of Muhammad, as they call them, or Muhammad's Gospels, the original 4 authors who wrote them, none of those copies exist. All are missing. Then you had then you've got the whole Ibn Hisham, Ibn Ishaq issue, where the originals are also missing. And then what you've got is a heavily edited, heavily redacted version that remains. So you've got a third generation copy that, and of the two surviving copies, the one has been heavily edited, and you don't know what's been spuriously added, maybe by someone else. If the
Mhm.
one, you don't know which one's the original and which are interpolations, which are extra additions that came later. It's so because so many early sources, and then you've got Abdul Malik made a Quran. He says that Uthman made the Quran and he burned all the other ones. And hey, we've just happened to have this one Quran that's the original surviving it. He redacted back to Uthman to give it authority. And there you've got, I mean, hey presto. So there's a lot of this funny business that's, I just want to show the audience something. I want to say thank
Mhm.
you to Erkan as well for your that donation. Thank you very much. Very grateful. Very kind of you. And guys, I do need to take a moment. The link to Odon's book is in the description, The Great Secret of Islam. So search for his name. Otherwise, search for The Great Secret of Islam. The download as a PDF is free. And you can also get it on Amazon if you want to support him. And then also, yeah, thanks guys. If you're enjoying this, then please do like, share, subscribe, all of those things. And I have to say something very YouTubey, like remember to floss and to brush your teeth at least twice per day, and do floss after meals because it's important to
Very,
say
very
some
important.
YouTubey things. And I think it's uncontroversial to say people should floss and brush their teeth, right, Odon?
Mhm. I could not
Okay,
agree more. Mm.
so I just want to mention something like this. This is the hadiths, okay? Just for the audience, many of you will know this already, but there's a level of incoherence. Like narrated Asma, daughter of Yazid ibn as-Sakan, I heard the messenger of Allah saying, "Do not kill your children secretly, for the milk with which a child is suckled while his mother is pregnant overtakes the horseman and throws him from his horse." Odon, this is theology of the highest order. I mean, this is incredibly important information, and this is incredibly deep. And can you please explain what they're trying to tell us here?
You see, it might have an Islamic explanation. It might, because when they were inventing the Islamic meaning of the Quran, they had to invent thousands of external stories to justify their invention. Um, and so maybe it has a meaning, I don't know, for a specific verse. You see, what I've done when I wrote my book, as I told you, the last part of the book is a Quranic study where I compare the Islamic interpretation of the Quran with the literal meaning of the text. And to do this, I read many tafsirs and
Yeah.
Islamic treatises about the Quran. And the thing is, for every verse, the various Islamic scholars have hundreds, tens of different stories, completely, sometimes completely ludicrous stories. But these stories, these hadiths, they serve a purpose. They
Yeah.
justify the Islamic interpretation of the text. So maybe it justifies something, but
Who knows? And then,
very,
I mean,
very ludicrous.
that's totally arbitrary and meaningless quote somehow. And then there's this. I mean, we'll get back to the topic immediately, but I mean, this is the apostle. So, did you guys know that Muhammad was fat? The apostle made for a rock on the mountain to climb it. He had become heavy by reason of age. And moreover, he had put on 2 coats of chainmail. Now, if he was a man of peace, why does he need chainmail? Did Jesus ever wear soldiers' armor and chainmail? I don't think so, but Muhammad did. When he tried to get up, he could not do so. So Muhammad was too fat to get on the rock. Ubaidullah squatted beneath him and lifted him up until he settled comfortably upon it. So yeah, it's just random things in the Islamic sources about the fat Muhammad, for instance. It's like why? And
The
they want to
thing
claim that this is the best known prophet ever with the most ever written about him, and most it's just 99% garbage.
maybe it has an explanation. Maybe it explains something. It explains a verse in the Quran. That's the thing with the Islamic narrative. It's not it might seem completely ludicrous at first sight, but it might have a purpose that you don't know of, because it is a very specific verse lost in the Quran that cannot be explained otherwise without this
Okay.
story of a rock. This is very very odd, and this is this is how the text was Islamicized. For every invention, for every new meaning, in order to give an Islamic meaning to a verse, you had to invent stories. And thousands, hundreds of thousands of stories were invented to justify the new interpretation of the text. And this is how scholars afterwards, modern scholarship, understood that the narrative was completely false. I want to read you a quote from Henri Lamens. Henri Lamens wrote in 1910, so more than 100 years ago, in his article Coran et Tradition, Quran and Tradition, he wrote that the Islamic tradition is a complete forgery. And he understood it by reading the various accounts in the Islamic narrative about Muhammad. Let me just quote him. It's my translation because he wrote in French. When Islamic tradition claims to present itself as an independent source of information, as a result of a vast investigation organized by contemporaries on the life of the Arab prophet, we can consider it one of the greatest historical deceptions recorded in literary annals. He also wrote in another article, almost a book, Fatima et les filles de Mahomet, Fatima and the daughters of Muhammad, in 1912. He wrote that the whole of the Sirah, every Sirah, cannot be considered as historical, because the Sirah has been invented, written, to give an Islamic explanation to the Quran. And it cannot, so it is derived from the Quran. And so you cannot understand the literal meaning of the Quran by reading the Sirah. The Sirah is an exegesis of the Quran. It is not an explanation. It is not a source for understanding the Quran. It is not an historical source. And because of this, most scholars and almost all Muslims are trapped in a sort of vicious circle, because they want to understand the Quran by referring to an external literature, the Sirah, the Hadith, that is based on the Quran. You see the vicious circle. Muslims are trapped into this, and most modern scholars, researchers, are also trapped within this vicious circle. They have to read Patricia Crone when she, the quote I gave, when she explained that you have to understand the Quran based on its own text and on previous sources or contemporary sources, but you cannot refer to Islamic literature to understand it.
Right. No, I agreed. It's just it just completely boggles the mind. It's just why these random stories sometimes. Oh wow! Thank you very much.
Because they needed to. Actually, the thing with Islam is that this process of invention urged the traditionists to invent stories upon stories, over stories, because actually the narrative is a discrepancy and incoherencies factory. As a sort of synthesis of what I've told, I explained that the Islamic narrative had to take into account the previous religious invention, had to fill in the gaps, had to Islamicize the remnants of actual history, had to Islamicize the Quran, and it had also to justify Islam. The Islamic narrative was also invented in order to justify its theology, its history, its law, its Sharia law, its system of government, and so on. It was also invented to justify the administration, the government of the caliphate, and to justify the caliph's behavior. The caliphs justified their behavior by comparing themselves to Muhammad. Muhammad could have any woman he wanted, so could the caliphs. Muhammad could have could sleep with a 9-year-old girl, so could the caliphs, and so on. And you see that the character of the Islamic Muhammad is a sort of composite character. There is a layer of the first layer of invention is we need an Arab prophet who gives a divine revelation. Thereafter, there is a layer of distorted memories from the 7th century Mahmad characters. But there is also thousands of layers of invention to justify the caliph's behavior, to justify Islam, to justify the government of the caliph, of the caliphate, and so on. Stories that were invented to restore coherence or plausibility, to establish logic within Islam, and stories that were invented to address the cascade of contradiction, inconsistencies, incoherencies, discrepancies that arose from these inventions. And this was something huge. They kept on inventing stories for centuries to correct what was wrong in the former stories. It's an incoherence factory. Really, it was made on an industrial level. It's something very, very huge. And this led to the building of the Islamic narrative. It was a layered construction, adding invention over invention. And I give you an example. In 746, we have John of Damascus, who writes about Islam as being the 99th heresy of Christianity, from Christianity. In his book, he writes that the Muslim he asks about Islam tell him that Muhammad, their prophet, is said to have received the revelation during his sleep, which means that at the time, the idea of an Arab prophet giving the revelation had already been invented, but the details of the revelation, as we know it today, were not invented yet.
There were 4 versions, actually, of how Muhammad received revelation. There were 4 versions. One was in his sleep. One was with a single angel, which was the final one they came to. There was a variety of angels, and then there were 2 angels at least. I covered this a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, in my series on the qira'at of the Quran, of the multiple varieties of the Quran. And when we came up with at least 42 different versions of the Quran, variations, and many of them with words that were completely contradictory. Like, for instance, Allah said to him, Allah said to her, right? Which is it? Or they stopped other people from going. They were stopped by other people from going. I mean, there are versions of the Quran that are directly contradictory. These versions simply don't match. So, but in that sense also, there were at least 4 versions prior to the Jibril gave it to him. There were at least 3 other versions of that story that existed. So and even the fact that the Quran is supposed to be tawatir, that was an invention of what, the 13th or 14th century. No scholars accepted it prior to about the 1500s. Only about then that the scholars said, okay, yeah, the Quran is coming from sources that are incontestable. Before that, it's like, well, yeah, kind of, maybe, no, not quite. We don't believe that. So many of these things are very late inventions, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century inventions.
Exactly. You see the process. It's a layered construction, invention over invention over inventions, in order to create Islam, but also to correct the discrepancies, because by inventing all of this stuff, it cannot go well. It always creates discrepancies. There are discrepancies in Mecca, for example, when you look in the when you look at what the Islamic narrative tells us about Mecca, it cannot fit what the Islamic text is saying. At least what the Islamic narrative is saying about the Quranic text. The Quranic text talks about Mecca being a region, the region of Mecca being fertile. Muhammad is supposed to talk to farmers and fishermen who eat freshly cooked fish and shellfish that cannot be in Mecca. He talks to farmers who are supposed to
What do you mean there's no shellfish and crabs and lobster in Mecca? What do you... Odon, come on. Allah can work in mysterious ways, Odon.
There are thousands, I don't know, I cannot know, more than thousands of discrepancies and incoherencies. I will detail one which is very interesting. It is the satanic verses issue. And by this process created discrepancies, and so they had to address the discrepancies. And how did they do? They invented new story. They rewrote the previous one. They tried to destroy the earlier versions of the stories when possible. This is why we do not have the Ibn Ishaq Sirah, I think. Ibn Ishaq Sirah has been redacted by Ibn Hisham a century after him. And we will never find Ibn Ishaq Sirah because I'm sure it has been destroyed to make place for a new story. But the new story creates new discrepancies, and in the end, you have a sort of vicious circles. You have inventions that create contradictions, incoherencies, inconsistencies, discrepancies, and so there is a need for correction, which leads to new inventions and new contradictions and new correction and new invention and so on and so on. There is this circle going on. It has gone on for centuries before it came to a level which was deemed acceptable by the caliphs and the religious authorities, which then took decisions to stop the interpretation of the Quran and to close the doors of the Ijtihad. But let me get to a very interesting example of this process, which is the satanic verses. It's a classic case which helps us to understand how the narrative was fabricated. So I have here a picture of the ancient Arab deities Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Al-Manat, who were worshipped in the pagan times way before Islam. Arabs, almost all Arabs, I think all Arabs had been Christianized in the 7th century. So there were no pagan religious activities anymore. There might still have been some pagan remnants, but the Arab were Christians. And what we see with the satanic verse, you know the thing about the satanic verses.
Yep, yeah.
In the
so Muhammad was bewitched
early version.
I mean, there's even stories of Muhammad being bewitched and speaking falsely. I mean, so it's really casts the whole Islamic narrative into doubt just on that basis. But he decided to make a pact with, I think it was the Quraysh. He would worship their gods for a year if they worshipped his Allah for a year. So which means he bowed to paganism.
Sort of. Actually, if you want to understand the story, you have to take into account that there were inventions. The first invention is that Muhammad is supposed to be the Islamic Muhammad, the Islamic character is supposed to be the author of the Quran. And another invention is that the Quran is God's exact word. And these two inventions created a major discrepancy because the text seemed to praise pagan divinities. In the original Quranic text, in the Surah 53, verse 19 to 21, there was this passage, have you seen Allat and Al-Uzza and Manat the third, the other? These are the high-flying deities. Verily, their intercession is hoped for. And this is the proof that the text at the origin was not what it was supposed, what the Islamic narrative told. It was not God's exact word, and Muhammad might not have been the author. In order to correct this discrepancy, there was an invention, the invention that Satan inspired Muhammad instead of God, or instead of the angel Gabriel. The verses 52 to 54 in Surah 22 might have been invented and added at the time, I don't know, or reinterpreted at the time. Tabari wrote about the Satan who inspired Muhammad, and also there were thousands, hundreds maybe, hundreds of hadiths that were invented where Muhammad talked about the Allat, Al-Uzza, and Al-Manat. You just have to look for it on Islamic tradition websites such as sunnah.com or sunnah.net. Just put Allat or Uzza in the research bar and look for all the hadiths of Muhammad saying that those divinities are not to be worshipped. You don't have to, please don't worship those divinities. I saw the apostle saying, I don't want people to worship Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. You find tens or hundreds of these hadiths, and they have been invented to support the claim that Muhammad was a monotheist preacher, and that the Quran is a monotheistic text. But by doing so, the traditionist who invented this story, this correction that Satan inspired Muhammad, they created a major discrepancy. Another one, which is the following: how is Muhammad?
It's interesting that the term Quranic,
if it can be inspired by Satan.
So sorry to interrupt you. That term Quranic seems to derive from Algeria and Tunisia.
Maybe.
No, I've got some references. I was planning to do something on this in the future, and I've got notes on that. And it seems to derive. I mean, it's not very little can be confirmed like 100% with a lot of things, but it seems to lean towards coming from North Africa, which is also just really odd, you know.
But you see how the correction or the cure they invented was worse than the disease, because the new discrepancy, the new incoherence introduced was very damaging for the credibility of Islam. How is Muhammad to be trusted if he can be inspired by Satan?
So and speak words inspired by Satan, and such a prophet is a false prophet and would be killed under Jewish law, under Mosaic law.
Exactly. So it could not stand, and they had to add a new invention, a new correction. They redacted the Quran, and so nowadays you won't find any Quran with the red part of the verse. These are the high-flying deities. Verily, their intercession is hoped for. And you see how the process worked. There were inventions that created discrepancies that needed correction. So there were new inventions, many inventions. inventions of chronicles, historical chronicles, inventions of hadith that created new discrepancies that needed a new correction. And you see the process, the vicious circle. And this is really, in my opinion, a classic case to understand how the Islamic narrative was fabricated, and the long process. You see how it needed centuries to get to the point of a religion and a narrative that was coherent enough, logical enough to be published, to be left like this. So I will come now to my conclusion, which is that this narrative is completely flawed because of all the discrepancies and incoherencies that were left, that couldn't have been addressed by the traditionists. It is because of the very nature of the fabrication process of this narrative. It was an industrial discrepancy factory, making historical discrepancies by the thousands, like, for example, the absence of early Islamic evidence or the absence of early Islamic sources. From an historical point of view, it cannot be.
There's actually evidence of ninth. Sorry.
Why is there absolutely no source, no Islamic source from the 7th or the 8th century? Why don't we have the documents? Why don't we have Uthmanic Qurans, for example? This is a major incoherence. It tells us that they were destroyed by Muslims themselves. We have sources from the 7th century, non-Muslim sources, or even Muslim sources that still exist, are referring to coins here, that contradicts the narrative, for example. We have geographical discrepancies, like the Qurayshi evidence in Syria, or everything that's wrong with Mecca. We have countless internal contradiction and incoherencies within the narrative and within Islam. For example, if you look in the Quran, we have different stances regarding the Torah and the Gospel. They are supposed to be God's word, and in the same time, they're supposed to have been redacted or falsified by Jews and Christians. And in the meantime, God supposedly in the Islamic reading of the Quran grants that his own word, meaning the Torah and the Gospel, cannot be changed. If you look, for example, the topic of the place of Abraham, the Maqam Ibrahim in the Quran, there is something very, very odd, because it's supposed to be in Mecca. But if you look at the description, it also fits Jerusalem. This is very, very strange. There is the status of the Jerusalem temple. If you look into the Islamic narrative, the Jerusalem temple should not exist. It has been founded and built there by Jews because of the Abraham tradition, because of the tradition that the place of Abraham would be in Jerusalem. But according to the Islamic narrative, the place of Abraham is in Mecca. So
Wait, but Odon, hold on. There's a mosque in Mecca on top of the old Temple of Solomon. Now, you know, it's normal architectural practice to first build a mosque in the air, and then later on you build a massive temple underneath it. That's standard architectural
I don't get the point, Lloyd. You're saying that Solomon's temple is also in Mecca?
No. I was saying that Muslims want to claim that they've, that Islam has been part of, in that part of the world and part of its history for so long, that they came first, that the Jews were never in Jerusalem, that they were there, that the Jews came, I don't know, in much later. But how is it that that they have a building standing on top of Solomon's temple. You would think that the logic is that the Jewish building came first, and then they put something on top of it. But according to their logic, they built, you know, their Dome of the Rock and other things first, and then the Jews built something underneath it later. Like, makes no sense.
Okay, I understand. But you see, this doesn't work with the Quran, because if you look in the Quran, there is a mention. There are several mentions of the Temple of Jerusalem. There are stories about David and Solomon and not Solomon, but David and Zachariah being in the temple in Jerusalem. But this cannot be. Within the Islamic narrative, the rightful place of Abraham is in Mecca, not in Jerusalem. So why would there be a temple in Jerusalem? If, according to the Islamic narrative, David is a prophet of Islam, Zachariah is also a prophet of Islam, what are they doing in the false temple of Jerusalem? You see, this discrepancy hasn't been addressed by the tradition, by the Islamic narrative. And it is still there. I've wrote an article about it. There are many other contradictions, incoherences.
And Mecca is the world's oldest city. The Kaaba is the world's oldest temple. It is the first temple, and yet we've got no mentions of it in history. There's no archaeology to prove a word of that.
For example, this is also a major discrepancy. There is the issue of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is supposed to be the the mosque from the night journey of the Prophet, but it has been built something like 50 or 620, no, 80 years after the Prophet supposedly came to Jerusalem, to the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Yeah, tied his little horse up there or whatever, and then left. But yeah, how could he? There was no mosque there. The Arabs had not been in Jerusalem yet. The entire history is completely false.
Exactly, it's completely false. It's flowed with contradiction and incoherences that stem from this completely mad process of fabrication. In the Quran, for example, the Christians, Nasara, according to the Islamic reading, are being depicted as being both friends and enemies of the believers, which also is something completely unlogic. If you look at Jesus' status within Islam, it's also something very, very odd. He is the one who comes back at the end of times. Why him and not Muhammad? Why is he the one who is supposed to judge mankind according to Islam and not Muhammad? There are many, countless incoherencies and contradictions. And because of this, the Caliph had to stop the process and to sort of petrify Islam. There is a process. There was a sort of petrification of Islam around the 10th and 11th century, where the I don't know if you can listen to, if you hear it, but there is there is something going on outside my window. No, it's okay. It's finished now. Okay. So let me finish. So they took decisions to stop the process. They declared that the Quran was uncreated. It was during the 9th century. They promulgated the doctrine of abrogation, and they closed the door of ijtihad, the door of the possibility of the interpretation of the Quran. They imposed the Quran as being absolutely sacred, and they also imposed that the figure of Muhammad should be revered almost like God himself. They impose an absolute sacredness of the figure of Muhammad, of the false Muhammad, the fabricated Muhammad they invented during this process. And because of this, Muslims are trapped, completely trapped, ensnared in a false narrative that they cannot understand. And they are completely unable, from their point of view, to see the discrepancies, to see the incoherences. They are completely trapped. The narrative, the fabrication of the Islamic narrative has made Islam into a trap for Muslims. It's something very, very sad to consider. All those people being trapped within this construction, this false narrative. So I will stop here. Just another slide here. I just wanted to show it, but it's just as an example. I won't comment. I won't go into the details. This graph is in my book. You will in the PDF file or in the book as well, and it shows the transfers, some of the transfer from real history to the Islamic narrative. And I just wanted to show it here. It's only a few transfers. There are thousands of transfers. They just show the complexity, how complex the process was when it took events from the real history and distorted the memories and changed them into events in the life of the Prophet of Islam. So just look for it in my book, in the PDF file on my website, and you will see how complex things are. So I think I've come to the end of it.
Yeah, it went longer than expected as well. It's been quite a while.
Yeah, I spoke a while. There may be questions.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you or
let me just, can I
sure.
unshare my screen? How do I do this?
I can do this from here.
Thank you. Thank you. I know I can see you.
Yeah. I just want to make a point. There's a couple of Muslims who are obviously using a script. They're repeating exactly the same phrase over and over. So it's several of them. I mean, obviously with Christian names, which is obviously the tactic. Many of them use Western names. And it says the core of Islamic teachings is to worship Allah, promote justice, kindness, and avoid evil. Satan, on the other hand, promotes sin and corruption, right? And then they say, so how can Islam be from Satan? Of course, they're failing to tell you that this is all defined within the Sharia, the Islamic legal system, and they promote justice according to the Sharia. And of course, they make it it's a multi-tier system where you've got Muslims at the top, Christians and Jews towards the bottom, and then everyone else below that. And kindness towards Muslims, but within the Aqidah or the Creed of Islam, they are obligated, they are honor bound to love Allah, and to love Allah, they then also have to demonstrate that by hating the non-Muslim. So they are taught that they are required to hate Jews, hate Muslims, hate non-Muslims, hate Christians, hate Hindus, etc. And of course, justice according to the Sharia, which includes the horrific things like stoning of women, chopping off of hands, and all of these things. And if you have the courage, you're welcome to, we can go through the Sharia page by page because these things are written, we can read them, and that is the Sharia law. And of course, so they try to put a very beautiful spin in it, but these are all lies. And yeah, and I mean, all of the horrible things that people learn about Islam, these things are true, and they're covered in the Sharia, and we can read them page after page after page. So propaganda. So yeah, back to you, Odon.
Wow. I'm a bit exhausted now.
Okay.
I can answer questions if some people have questions. I can answer yours.
No, I mean, I think we had a bit of I tried not to interrupt you too much, but you made me think of things and I raised those questions. I mean, there were a few other things I could have raised as well, but then, but we've already had, previous talk, we showed how common Muslim stories about Muhammad, like the story of Khadija's age. Scholars will say bluntly that's false. She was never 40 years old. She was 25, or maybe she was 28, maybe she was 27. Could have been 29, possibly 32, maybe 36. Almost definitely 26. Because how do you have 6 children at age 40 in the 7th century in the desert? Right. So, and they'll say that these narrations all come from the weakest chains of narration, the weakest of hadiths. And then, of course, the story of how the propaganda they use. I mean, this is Muslim scholars writing in Muslim texts for Muslims, stating that the story of Muhammad who carried a woman's luggage is false. The story of the garbage, the woman who threw garbage at Muhammad, or whatever the garbage story that they keep telling us, how tolerant Muhammad was to the woman who left garbage on his lawn or whatever it is completely false. So we showed that last week, and Islam admits, I mean, if you read, it's sufficient. And I mean, if you've got the software like I have now to go through thousands of books, you start to find that Muslim scholars themselves will openly state that this is false, that's false, that's false, that's false, even though these are common stories.
So, yes. Muslim scholars have developed a system to justify their own stories, the system with the isnads and so on. In the end, it has absolutely no scientific value. The thing with those kind of hadiths is that you have to
Yeah. Here's one question. There's one good question that I think we can sort of end by answering this question.
Let me just I'll answer it, but let me just finish my point. When you look at all these hadiths, you have to examine them with a critical mind, and you have to apply the criterion of embarrassment, but not the criterion of logical embarrassment, but of Islamic embarrassment. If you want to get some truth from the Islamic narrative, some truth from the hadith, for example, about Khadija, it's very embarrassing that she was older than Muhammad, and Muhammad was his employee. This is embarrassing. So there might be some truth. This is embarrassing for Islam. Logically, it's not embarrassing, but it's embarrassing for Islam. So there might be some truth in the fact that she existed. She was older than him, and she was more powerful and richer than him, than the historical Muhammad, not the prophet of Islam, who is a complete creation, a fantasy. For me, the prophet of Islam is a bit like Santa Claus. When I say this to Muslims, they aren't very happy. But if you look into the character of Santa Claus, it's exactly this. There was a vague historical story about Saint Nicholas in the 5th century, and there were traditions about him in Germany, where he was made into a gentle character towards children, who gave children gifts in the month of December. And people from Germany came into the US. They brought this tradition with them, the tradition of Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus. And the tradition evolved. Coca-Cola took Santa Claus and ripped him of his green clothes and put him in its own colors, red and white. He was put as the figure for Christmas, and in the end, we have a character, Santa Claus, who is almost a fantasy. He is a fantasy. He's a fictional character, with very, very little connection to the historical Nicholas. And it's a bit like this for Muhammad. With Muhammad, we have an historical Muhammad, or several historical Muhammads, and we have a prophet of Islam who has been so much fabricated and reworked and reprocessed that there is almost no connection to the historical figure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, agreed. I mean, that was in the 1950s, and now we think it goes back hundreds of years, but actually it just goes back to the 50s by Coca-Cola. Just to answer this question, and then there's one other because it's gone a few hours and it's 10 p.m. here, and as you know, I rushed back and I got here like less than 10 minutes before we went on, and I haven't had dinner yet. So, I was out, I was busy, and I got back in a big hurry. So, with all the evidence that the Islamic narrative was fabricated, do you think Muslims will ever accept this? I mean, it's hard. The tribal narrative is violence if you go against the tribe, and there are consequences. If they cannot use violence, they will ostracize you. So there's a penalty. There's a social. There's a financial, social, or personal penalty of some type that you are going to pay. And also, we are very, as Christians, as Westerners, we don't really offer Muslims an alternative. So when they leave Islam, where do they go? We need to give them a home to come to. So you need to offer them an alternative, give them a place they can fall. And it's very tough. I mean, to leave that if they're within the social group, it's extremely hard. But yeah, also there's all the Dawagandists, and it's going to be an effort. Your thoughts? It's hard to make the move. I think some will, many won't. I mean,
I completely agree with you. I would add that Islam imposed a specific mindset, a specific Islamic mindset, where you cannot think with logic. You think you think in the wrong way. You don't examine the facts to come to a conclusion. You already have the conclusion, which is Islam is the truth. Islam is the way for the world. Islam is salvation. And you start from the conclusion, and then you change the facts in order to fit the conclusion. So when a Muslim sees, for example, should a Muslim see our video together about the fabrication of Islamic narrative, he will not be able to understand what we are talking about, because his reason has been hijacked by Islam. He doesn't think logically. He already has the answers, so he won't examine the facts that we provided. He will distort what we have said in order to fit his own conclusion, which is we are infidels, we lie, we deceive, we cannot be trusted, everything we say has no value. But there might be some, you see, for me, Islam is a sort of schizophrenia, the psychiatric illness. It's not an illness per se, but it's a bit like schizophrenia in the sense that a Muslim lives in a fantasy reality. His fantasy is that the Islamic narrative is true and that Islam is true. It's a fantasy. It doesn't exist in the real world.
Yeah.
But he thinks that his fantasy is more real than the real world. And the only way to shake Islam out of him is for reality to come forcefully into his fantasy. And for this, you have to have a real event that is strong enough to shock him. For example, the violence of jihad. It has been a wake-up call for many Muslims who understood that there is something wrong. Because the violence of the jihadis in Syria, for example, was too terrible to be dismissed. Or they need something real. For example, the fact that there is no water in Mecca. This is real. They can understand that there cannot be agriculture or fishing in Mecca. This is a strong argument because it is tangible.
Odon, Mecca Lake. There was a lake. Mecca Lake, they went fishing there, and then it dried up because of global warming, or the moon fell into it, or something. Odon.
The camels drank it all.
The camels drank. Yeah, there you go. So, Yeah. Last question, because it's late and we've gone very long. We've gone 3 hours, 92 minutes, and a lot longer than I anticipated. Just this question, I know it's very well phrased, but just a quick answer. Can you guarantee there is no historical relic of Muhammad, Ali, Abu Uthman so far, Abu Bakr? What if Islam fabricates, backdates some evidence like forgery of documents and coins? The coins are very hard to fabricate. The coins are largely Christian coins, and you see them change. Where coins are repurposed, like you see Persian coins getting repurposed to Islamic coins, same style. So clearly, there's a Persian culture, then there's this blending of the two cultures, then there's the Muslim culture. Same with the Christian coins. But the coins are very hard to. The coins really are nail in the coffin. And by the same token, there are coins from the Jewish period, like the year 140 or something like that, that say for instance, there are coins from the revolt of the Jews against the Romans called the first year of the Jewish Empire or something like that, which proves the Jews were there in Israel. And of course, there are no Palestinian coins. If anyone can find me some, a tribe called the Palestinians, there isn't one. There never was one. But then it says, can you guarantee there's no historical relic of Muhammad? I mean, what evidence do we have? There's a footprint in a rock, sure. There's a big footprint in a rock. That's there you go. Ali, who knows? Abu Bakr, Uthman, we know he burned the Quran. I mean, so do we have any evidence? I mean, do the Muslims have any evidence for these characters?
There's another way to answer the question. Muhammad, Ali, Abu Bakr, and even Uthman, they are not historical figures. They are recreation or creations from the Islamic narrative. So we won't find any historical relic of an Islamic Muhammad, an Islamic Ali, an Islamic Abu Bakr, or an Islamic Uthman. When you get to understand that the Islamic narrative is an invention, the Islamic character of Ali is an invention. He is based loosely on the 7th century armed prophets who believed that they were the Messiah themselves. But you see the Muhammad character, the Islamic Muhammad character, in my opinion, it already incorporates remnants of the historical Ali and remnants of other characters. So they are not historical figures, so we won't find anything about them. And actually, we have absolutely no evidence for them as being historical figures. We don't have anything about Uthman bin Affan outside the tradition, the Islamic tradition. The only thing we have are some testimonies about the existence of a man or several men nicknamed Mahmad in the 7th century. This is the only thing we have. And it's not evidence enough to prove the existence of the Islamic Muhammad. But it's evidence enough to prove for some of these sources that the Islamic Muhammad is a fabrication.
Yeah, I mean, if they had the evidence, if they had the archaeology, they would show it. But where is it? So yeah, Odon, it's gone a lot later than anticipated.
Okay.
So thank you, but we'll be seeing you again soon. I mean, we'll make a plan. I will. I'll be traveling again this week. I've got a couple of shows planned, and then I'll be traveling for a week, and I'll be back, and we can make a plan for the next one. But thank you. This is really, really good. It's been very, very enlightening again.
Thank you for having me, Lloyd. It was great. I hope the audience is happy. And see you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you all. God bless. Take care, and we'll see you all soon. Take care, everyone.